why should you go to Theology Beer Camp? Man, I'm so excited for this, and we've already had a hype session with Ryan Does, Trip Fuller, and TJ and myself. We had Will interviewing Donna Bowman about this, and now I'm here with the one and only Dr. James McGrath, so that we can continue our discussion about why you need to be at Theology Beer Camp. So James is a professor of religious studies at Butler University, and James, of all of the people, I think you're probably the one I'm most excited to talk to at the event, if for no other reason than the topic. But I'm gonna let you tell them why are you going to Theology Beer Camp? What are you going to be doing?
Yeah, well, I mean, short answer is I have no idea because Theology Beer Camp is full of surprises, and I'm expecting the unexpected. It's Trip Fuller, whatever he does, it's zesty, and so it's going to be but yeah, I'm excited because it's like theology, beer, camp, right? I mean, one of those might have been appealing. Two, it's like okay, definitely, and it's like but what I was asked to focus on, was to do something related to, we're toying with ideas. We're talking about Doctor Who, talking about Star Trek, and looks like I'm going to be spending some time talking about theology, Doctor Who, and Star Trek by the looks of things. And I really like comparing those two franchises in particular, not because of anything that's particularly similar or that's particularly different that makes for a nice contrast, but just because they've both been on the air about the same time. Obviously in different forms, but that's again one of the things that's interesting about it. Star Trek has evolved over the course of a lot of different series. Doctor Who has always been Doctor Who, but anyone who's watched all the way through knows that just like the Doctor has always been one Doctor, even though it's still the Doctor, the show has not always been one show. And so there's so much that one can do at the intersection between the shows and each other, but also you bring theology into the mix, and I think there's lots there that's interesting to talk about.
We're gonna squeeze in a Torchwood conversation too, or
what?
A Torchwood? Was it Torchwood, or was it what's the one, the spin-off of Captain?
That's one. There's also there's also the Sarah Jane Chronicles, and there's all kinds of other things.
Man, so much fun.
I mean, is that the equivalent of bringing in Lower Decks, or I don't know what the?
Yes, we are bringing in Lower Decks.
So
that's not a question. I love Lower Decks, man. I'm so excited for the new season coming up. So I heard Trip was telling us there's going to be like 3 main stages, and one's going to be for like the scholarly nerdy stuff, and then one's going to be like some of the main stuff. And he's like, and then we're going to have the other main stage is going to be the geek stage. And I was like, okay, all right. So like last year, our group, we had like maybe 2 kind of group geek sessions in one of the smaller rooms. And it's like, now he's kind of putting it in the forefront. All the branding is like Star Wars. And I was like, okay. And even then I was assuming it was going to be like, there'll be a Star Wars time, Lord of the Rings time, like normal stuff. And then he was like, then there's going to be a Doctor Who time. And I was like, what'd you say, Drew? Because I love the Doctor. My avatar on our show, everybody has their own avatar, is my face on like David Tennant's Doctor. And I'm like, this is it. This is my moment. so excited that you were going to come, and we're going to talk about Doctor Who. Yeah.
And I can talk about, I can talk equally well about Star Wars. I'm always reluctant to work in Star Trek or Star Wars and not talk about the other, because then people think I'm one of these people who's a fan of one and not the other. I love them both. It's just that I have, among other things, I can't afford Jedi robes. That's like more expensive cosplay. Whereas, you can go on Amazon or eBay, you can get the Starfleet shirt, and you put that on with some, black pants, and you're all set, And so, then as far as Doctor Who goes, it took a really long time. I'd sometimes, maybe don a bow tie and, a jacket or something and try and do what I could. But it took a long time until my wife, who is very skilled and in a variety of arts and craftsy types of things, realized that if she made me a 4th Doctor scarf, it would not just be something I would pull out for like conventions or geek fests of various sorts. It's something I would actually wear in the winter, and I do. So I sport my fandom on campus whenever I can.
Oh, man, I'll say I don't wear scarves, but if I had that scarf, that's a different story. Oh man, it's there's so much fun stuff, and we don't want to spoil Theology Beer Camp for everybody, so we're just going to give them a taste, let them know what you're about, let them know about the camp themselves. Our code down there, Geekology God Pod, that they can check out, $25 off admission. It's going to be pretty cool. Discounts are always cool, but man, as far as like the Doctor, Star Trek, all that goes, honestly, I'm probably Doctor Who is probably my favorite, but then of Star Trek, Star Wars, I think I do prefer Star Wars, but Star Trek is so new to me that I probably talk about it more.
Yeah, and one of the great things at the intersection of the three that also intersects with theology is that Star Trek, a lot of people think of as very secular. It's like there's no chaplain on the Enterprise in the original series, things like that, and yet the very first episode that they made after the original pilot, which didn't get a green light, so they made a second pilot, and that became the episode Where No Man Has Gone Before, and Captain Kirk is talking about theology in it. It's like, what is it? What are the characteristics of a god? As one of his crew members is turning into a god or something else, but that's and that's Star Wars people think of as having something to do with religion because you've got the Force there and the Jedi and all these kinds of things, which is one of the reasons why I like talking about the two in tandem or talking about Doctor Who, because each of them does something that is certainly different from a lot of stereotypes of, let's say, Christian theology, and yet is engaging with theology in some way, whether explicitly or implicitly. And so there's all kinds of fun stuff there to talk about.
Man, and maybe we can get a good Star Wars, Star Trek comparison going on at Beer Camp. I know personally the Ahsoka like story of deconstruction and then possibly reconstruction. We're still kind of waiting to figure out what she's going to do with this. I love that. As someone who's kind of like gone through some of that journey in my own faith, I'm like, ooh, this is going to be good.
My own view, which even some official statements by George Lucas, are sometimes in tension with this, but some of his statements are in tension with each other, and so I'm not going to worry about that too much. It's interesting that in fandom, when they're talking about canon and things like that, and they look to the creator of a franchise for an official pronouncement, in fandom world they call it the Word of God. It's just like parallels. Anyone? Yeah, I think there might be a few. And those who work through from maybe a more conservative background, the fact that there are contradictions in the Word of God is also par for the course. Sometimes diehard fans have a bigger harder time with that in the realm of Star Wars than some of us do in relation to the Bible.
Yeah. Well, I did want to, while I had you, talk a little bit about Star Trek and Doctor Who, kind of whet everybody's appetite. So let's start with Star Trek. What is it specifically about this series? I know you mentioned a little bit already, but what is it that pulls you in that you love?
And is that Star Trek as a whole, or is it this? When you say this series, my mind immediately goes.
Oh, yeah. I just mean as a whole.
Latest one. I mean, I think even though Doctor Who has maintained this sort of continuity, I think Star Trek, thanks to some things that have happened recently and been on the air recently, probably wins television award, at least in my books, for the longest amount of time that passed between an episode and then another episode in the same franchise starting with previously on, right? So you get this thing where they go back to essentially the original pilot that then got woven into an original series episode, and so it's like okay, more than 50 years since then. That's impressive, right? And there's obviously some reliance on the fact that people are going to get this, get these references, and so it shows that there's this fandom, and this appreciation for this franchise and the story that is not just episodic, if you will, but really does not just maintain a love for this thing across time, but pass it on, right? Because this could not work as television, just catering to people who were alive to see the original series, right? got to be something that works for other people who, if they haven't seen this, will go and say, okay, what the heck was that about? And then you had this revisiting and re-envisaging of the balance of power. So there are all these points where it's really doing this prequel thing, wonderfully. And ever since on Discovery, the Enterprise appeared, commanded by Captain Pike, I was like, oh, this is good stuff. This is, because they're going to take us back and they're going to explore these things and they're going to do that. And for the longest time, my favorite captain, every Star Trek fan has a favorite captain, was Commander Sisko. But then, and Deep Space Nine did some great stuff with religion and diversity and things like that. But then Captain Pike, there's this episode where he's talking about his family and says that he had a parent who was someone who taught both science and religious studies. And then he's talking about God and Asimov's third law and how they relate to one another and things like that. And I was like, okay, I'm hooked. And so quickly bought a shirt. I can play the part and pretend I can pontificate about science and religion and the intersection between the two.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah. You mentioned Lower Decks and all of these like timeline, like different things. I think Star Trek uses just enough time travel that it can like retcon when it needs to. I'm doing a little bit of bouncing back and forth here myself. The reason I wanted to bring up Lower Decks was because I grew up with the original Star Trek movies. Okay. And then everybody kept trying to get me to watch Next Gen. And, I'm known as Josh with wrong opinions. I never got into Next Gen. I don't know what it was. I'd always get like a season in and just forget that I was watching it. But I got into Lower Decks and they do all these like callbacks and little jokes and stuff. And I'm like, well, I need to understand the jokes better. So then I go back and start watching all these series. Deep Space Nine was absolutely one of my favorites. And then, like the time travel stuff, like Lower Decks recently was in Strange New Worlds, which is like some of that prequel stuff that you're mentioning is the Strange New Worlds, which I've mentioned a lot on our show recently. And one of the cool things, they kind of retconned very like subtly because there was a little bit of time travel. So they had like an excuse to do it. The Genocide Wars in Star Trek were originally would have already happened or been happening right now. Something like that, right?
That sounds right.
Yeah. But they changed it so it was in the future again because as is, if they went with their original timeline, we're all stuck going, there's no genocide war happening.
Yeah, well, it's, I mean, to be honest, with politics and world events, I'm like, well, any day now, don't assume it's not going to happen according to the timeline. Although I really would love for that to be,
never happen. Yeah,
in the future, but never, right?
Yeah.
Of course, Doctor Who does more with the idea of time can be rewritten, and being met with a famous reply of "Don't you dare!" Right? Because sometimes history even with its negative parts, it's like, well, wouldn't change it. But Star Trek has done more with that lately, especially since Enterprise brought in the whole notion of a temporal Cold War and things like that. It's like, But even going back to the original series, with the Guardian of Forever and things like that, the idea that time could be rewritten. And that's another element that's made a reappearance recently in a fun sort of way.
Yeah, I got a fun question for you.
Okay.
Like I mentioned, since I grew up watching the original movies, I always loved Captain Kirk.
Yeah.
Even though now that we're a little bit older in modern times, I look at it and I'm like, yeah, Captain Kirk was kind of a womanizer and kind of not great, really. But now we have this new Captain Kirk in the series, and it's like he's sort of like that, but he's actually a good guy, it seems like still. Do you think they're retconning Kirk?
I do. He certainly, it's interesting, even in the J.J. Abrams movies, I felt as though, he was the character that was the most different from the original series. Whereas, I mean, McCoy and Spock, and I was like, oh my gosh, I could totally believe that these are the same person, right? Just a little bit younger. Yeah. And they did weave that in, that his timeline changed more than other people's had, and so they kind of offer an explanation of that. But still, I think that Kirk, in a lot of ways, is is problematic. But I mean, the truth is the original series is problematic in all those same ways, right? And Gene Roddenberry had a vision for diversity and other things that didn't extend to gender equity. If the Enterprise is anything to go by, I mean, you do have crew, and I love that Uhura is there and is on the bridge and is able to take her role in navigation, is able to do other things. She just moves between roles as you'd expect any great officer to do. But on the other hand, some of the things that are said in scripts are disparaging of her as a woman, right? The robot scanning, and saying, making some comment about disparate mess of emotions, or I can't remember the exact line. Hopefully no one will judge me as a true fan. Judge my true fan credentials. I sometimes struggle in the same way to get the wording of the Bible exactly right. It's just because I'm translating directly from the original Klingon, right? So that's the
of course, So
sexism was a problem, and I remember watching the original series again recently and being like, "Oh my gosh, my childhood memories are just being ruined here."
Yeah, and it's interesting. What was it? C.S. Lewis calls it a chronological snobbery, right? Of like holding other times to our standards. And if I had to wager a guess, if I was watching it live when it was happening, it would have been an incredibly progressive show when that original series came out. And as time goes on, our morals change. We learn, hopefully, as a culture. Personally, I believe in kind of an arc to the universe, like a story arc. And we are getting closer and closer to what God designed us for, I think. And I think a lot of that is love, and it's going to include equality and all that stuff. So hopefully we always look back and go, man, we were terrible 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, the problem is not, I think, doing that. It's saying, thankfully we're not like that, right?
Yeah.
And the takeaway message should be, however, 50 years ago looks to you now, that's how you will likely look in 50 years, unless you are, very, very progressive, not just in relation to, issues of the past, but issues of the present, right? I mean, and so that's the thing, there's the sort of, there are two main approaches to the Bible, and people approach fandom the same way and approach, morals the same way. One is, that's the way it is in these classic texts, and so we stick with that. And the other says, okay, there's a trajectory, there's an arc, right? And this is we're seeing some points on it, and they're pointing us to the need to keep moving in that direction, even if we reach the point where some of the things that they were focused on are taken for granted, right? So we don't say, well, look, we include Gentiles now, and so we're progressive just like Paul, and yet we're defending slavery, or preventing women from going into ministry or doing whatever else. And there's this real lack of awareness among those who adopt that approach, that they keep updating and saying, oh yes, this thing that we took a stand on, we're going to sweep that under the carpet. But there's never a questioning of the approach to the Bible that leads them to make the same mistakes over and over and over again.
I'm going to dive a little bit into this Bible thing, and then we're going to go back to the geeky fun.
This is geeky fun too.
Yeah, this is good. Yeah,
that's what Theology Beer Camp. It's like we're going to geek. It's theology and it's geekery and it's and there aren't too many places where you get to actually geek out equally about both, right? And so that's what
we strive to do with our show all the time. And we might not always succeed. Sometimes we get carried away with the geekery. But I'm going to go more into this theology stuff, because I, for those who are listening, know that I'm preparing to get into law school and pursuing that thing. And when you look at like legal philosophies, especially here in America, you kind of end up with these 3 different views of the Constitution. And I think we do that with the Bible, and people haven't noticed. And Tripp keeps saying that I'm like one of the most conservative people at Theology Beer Camp, and he's probably right. But so when we're talking about law, when you look at the Constitution, there's people who are originalist, textualist, and then like living Constitution. And I think a lot of what we're looking at is we only see textualist and living constitution when we're looking at the Bible. We either see people who are, it literally means what the text says, or people who are doing this like trajectory and what is, it evolves and it grows. I probably am one of the rare people who are like originalist with the Bible. And I'm like, okay, but what was the purpose of this being written? And that's the thing that I care about, not necessarily exactly what the text says. And I'm not trying to like do whatever I want with it and like, whatever. But I'm like, I think it genuinely matters to look at what the original authors, whether, I personally think that humans authored it and God had something to do with that. I don't think God just handed us the word. I know some people kind of believe that kind of way. That's just, it's not me. But I think it's interesting that a lot of the times, and tell me if you see this too, but it seems like people kind of frame our reading of the Bible as you're either textualist or progressive living, and they don't mention kind of other alternative ways of reading it.
Yeah. What you described reminds me of something that James Barr, I think it was, the New Testament scholar or the biblical scholar, said about the Bible and literalism, which is that it's important to take the text literally in the sense of understand that in its original context, it was saying some things that we can't possibly affirm as true today, in order to be free to take principles and apply them in new ways and do things like that. I mean, you get the debates between people who say, well, Genesis 1 it's just a poem, and there's nothing ever intended literally there, and people are like, there's a dome in this text, and therefore we must believe that there is a dome. Interesting how the so-called literalists, it's rarely the dome that they're like, you must believe in this. I heard one guy who's a flat earther tried to launch himself with a jetpack to prove that the Earth was flat, and got himself killed in the process. Apparently, this is not a healthy belief system. The other view is also potentially problematic. I think that recognizing that this text was a text of its time can help us both understand what it meant and look for ways of being true to what we think is there that stands the test of time, without feeling the need to bend over backwards either to insist that it's literally true even today, or to insist that no one ever thought differently than we think today. They were always just like us.
Yeah, which, hey, maybe that's also a healthy way to look at some of these older IPs that we enjoy in fandoms too, rather than looking at it and going, oh man, they were terrible to women, and kind of seeing the intent of, at their time, they were trying to show that women are just as important as men. And what does that look like in our context with our hopefully better understanding now? And I think maybe that's a healthier way to look at it, other than just being like, oh, that was awful, or, oh, that's fine,
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And I think that there's nothing untrue to Gene Roddenberry's vision or the original series of Star Trek to give uniforms that are not the 1960s miniskirts that they were wearing.
Thankfully.
Yeah.
I'm glad they don't do that.
One of my favorite episodes of the whole, out of all of Star Trek is Trials and Tribulations from Deep Space Nine, where they actually go back into the episode Trouble with Tribbles, and you have all this just having fun with the differences. The Klingons looking different, and the different uniforms, and the different communicators. There's this wonderful point where it's like Cisco to Defiant, and he's like, oh yeah, and then flips open the communicator, Cisco to Defiant. It's like,
oh man, yeah.
They didn't update the technology at all. Nobody would watch any of the current Star Trek that's set in the time of the original series or before.
Not. Yeah, I just think it's really funny how Star Trek isn't afraid to acknowledge that. They just play around with it and move on. I mentioned I watched Deep Space Nine. I feel like I underplayed it. Whenever I was going through everything and like trying to figure out the jokes for Lower Decks, I'm watching all these series. I found Deep Space Nine, and I've seen it I think I'm going through it the 4th time this year. The whole series. I love that show, man. And I think that'll probably, that or Lower Decks is probably my favorite of the Star Trek series. So before we move on, could you tell us now, which one's your favorite series and who's your favorite captain?
Yeah, well, I hinted at that. I'm pretty much, I really do like the sort of re-envisaged original series Pike getting to
he's cool,
do his thing. Really enjoying that. When I think about it, it's probably been the case that whichever one I'm watching sort of is my favorite at the time. I mean, I was introduced to the show, the original series, not when it was first on, but in reruns and things like that. For those of your viewers who remember reruns, back when that was a thing. Loved Jean-Luc Picard. Captain Janeway, has a monument right here in the state that I live in. So,
that's cool. That's cool, man.
Yeah, I'm just like I can appreciate all the franchises without feeling the need to be a literalist or a defender of every detail. There are flaws in every human being, and Starfleet captains are no exception. And there's something I love about each of them that makes them stand out. So,
yeah, honestly, for me, it's a lot harder to pick a favorite series. So I think I'm probably with you on that. The Captain, it absolutely has to be Sisko or Pike. Like, they're both so good. Like, yeah. So I think I'm just agree. Yeah,
aren't you? Yeah.
So, man, I don't want to not talk about Doctor Who. There's so much good stuff, and that's why they need to go to Theology Beer Camp so they can hear more of these kind of conversations. But when we're talking about Doctor Who, the first question's always got to be the same. Who is your doctor? Not who's your favorite, but who is your doctor?
Yeah.
If you watch Doctor Who, you know what we mean.
Right. So I started with Peter Davison. Right.
Yeah.
And I have got to meet him at Gen Con, a local gaming convention that sometimes brings people in. That was where I started. It was just one part because they used to be in these parts. They break it into four chunks. Each one with a cliffhanger at the end. And I first saw the show. It must have been on PBS because that was who aired them back when it was on regular broadcast television. And I was somewhere on vacation with my family. We were in the hotel room at the end of the day. It was before cable, and so looking to see what's on TV. And there was Doctor Who, which I hadn't seen before. And there was this episode of I think it was part one of Four to Doomsday. And these people keep going into and out of this thing that looks like a phone booth, and I had no idea. I was like, that was really, really puzzling if you're just being thrown in the deep end of Doctor Who. But this thing was gripping, and it was interesting. It was different from anything I'd seen before. And then there's a cliffhanger, and of course, if you're on vacation, you're not sticking around to watch it. So when I got back, I turned it on, and then was immediately puzzled by the fact that I think by that point it was either John Pertwee or Tom Baker episodes that PBS was airing at the time, and so was confused again by that. But yeah, started off with Peter Davison. Was the fifth Doctor, although actually time can be rewritten, and there's also apparently a prehistory before the first Doctor, as we've been discovering.
Yeah,
and so
I think it's funny they did that, and we're all still just use the same numbers, just because I guess it's easier.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like John Hurt. He's the Doctor, but we don't use that to change the numbering because that's just confusing. But I
have to ditch numbers, but calling them by the name of the actor also just feels wrong to me. In some way, it's like breaking the third wall, as they say.
Yeah, it's like, well, especially now that David Tennant's going to be two of them,
right?
So now we have to do 10 and 14,
right? And we already had a hint that Tom Baker was more than one of them, right? It shows up as the curator there and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's so funny. Whenever he did that, my first reaction was, "That means David Tennant could come back."
Right.
And then now it's happening. Yeah, my first was David Tennant, and so that's he's always been my Doctor. I love David Tennant. My favorite might be Capaldi. It's either him or Capaldi, but my Doctor is definitely number 10.
Yeah.
And ironically, so the first one I ever watched was Satan's Pit, and my roommate at college made me watch it because he knows I like religion and stuff, and he's like, "I think you'd find this interesting," and I did. And it was funny. We watched this 2-part thing, and I left it alone for about a year, and it was almost like an itch in the back of my brain. And eventually, like a year later, I was like, I'm going to watch more of that. And I picked up where I was. I had no idea that the Doctor regenerated. I was so angry when Tennant died. I was like, what the crap is this? Right. I had no idea. Oh, man. So, for those who don't know, the Doctor regenerates. He dies and he comes back, and they're supposed to be 12, and it turns out that he's allowed to have more for kind of convoluted reasons.
Yeah. In Doctor Who fandom, we don't say convoluted. We say wibbly wobbly, timey wimey.
Yes. Because wibbly wobbly.
Yeah. But
Oh,
yeah, no, it's a great show, and it has so many elements. So I see your question on the
yeah.
screen there. That might be a place to go next.
Yeah. That's what I was gonna say. Since Davison was the fifth was your favorite, which I gotta say, if I was doing like a top three, he's probably there. I loved his older stuff, especially. I think the first thing I saw him was with the Five Doctors. That does it count as a movie? I don't know what that counts as. It was so good though. Um, which one? Which one do you prefer? Classic Who since you started with it, or do you prefer New Who?
Well, look, there's no way to prefer something where I've heard the anecdotal tidbit of trivia that the budget for a series of Doctor Who when it first started was about the same as for one episode of Star Trek when it first started. So there's no way you can watch present day special effects on Doctor Who or any other franchise and then go back and look at the hand wrapped in bubble wrap that's been spray painted green and say, oh, I prefer that. But some of the stories actually were really good, and at least I'd say they were as good as the newer ones, and some of them certainly stand out as better than some of the newer ones. I think they're really wonderful stories. They're great speeches by the Doctor, all across the franchise. One thing that I think was great, I don't know how far back you've gone in watching the show. Patrick Troughton is wonderful. I mean, he really was the one who introduced something of the humor, the buffoon, the Doctor sort of, what Tom Baker then took and ran with and developed in his own way, and everybody associates with him. The Doctor, being really brilliant, but, sort of playing a bit of a buffoon in order to, kind of fly under the radar of, people that he then sort of defeats. But one thing that happened, so I was determined to watch and blog about, and I did actually manage to do this. I'm not sure that I've blogged about every single episode that's been on lately. I can't remember. I've tried to, but I went back and blogged through the entirety of classic Doctor Who. Wow. And fans will know that there are some lost episodes, right? There are some episodes where they wiped it. They said, we can reuse this, film for something else. And so we don't have the actual film, but we have the audio because people love this show so much that they recorded the audio. Mm-hmm. And so what they've done with all of those is turn them into audiobooks. And they're phenomenal because on the one hand, you get to watch, as it were, these classic episodes, listen to them. And they've added linking narration and things so that you can enjoy the whole thing without seeing what's on screen. And yet, sometimes I've gone and looked up sort of scenes from, where they have some stills from those episodes. And when I see what the robots or the aliens or whatever were supposed to look like, I mean, my imagination has a much bigger special effects budget than the show had at that stage. And so it's a great way to go back and enjoy these.
Yeah.
Because actually what your imagination will do with these great stories is, essentially update the special effects. And so there's an analogy that one can make with, the way things that people do with the Bible and theology that I think is potentially instructive there.
Yeah. And in canon, there's a lot of different ways to consume Doctor Who. There's comics, audiobooks, kind of stuff. The Eighth Doctor, if you're talking about screen time, was only in a movie that happened between classic and New Who, but his audiobooks are so good, man.
And let me throw in there, although, probably mention this at, the beer camp as well, because it deserves a mention in case anybody has missed this episode. They shouldn't have missed this episode of your show, but there is an Peter Davison's Doctor, right? So Fifth Doctor, audiobook, Doctor Who, The Council of Nicaea. Seriously, I'm not joking. Look it up. And it's written by Carolyn Simcoe.
I'm downloading it now.
who is an ordained Anglican minister and also is a Doctor Who fan and is married to someone who has written some of the episodes, including ones that aired on television. And so it's a Whovian family. But, there are some subtle ways that you can explore sort of Doctor Who and, connections with theology, things like that. But there are some really explicit ones, particularly when you expand beyond the aired episodes to audiobooks and things like that.
Yeah, and it's hard for it not to have some like pseudo religious themes because we're talking about a being who's been around thousands of years, can die and come back again, and kind of overwatches humanity. So it's like it's really hard for it not to have
Yeah.
some of those themes. Yeah, and you know this is actually an impossible question between classic and new Who, because honestly, some of my favorites are in both, some of my least favorites are in both. I don't
Yep.
remember who it is. I'll be honest, I just don't like the third Doctor. He gets on my nerves. And it just, is what it is. It's fine.
Yeah.
A lot of people felt that way about Jodie Whittaker. I liked her as the Doctor. The show itself, the writing, I was like, I don't know what y'all are doing, but the Doctor was cool.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I felt, Jodie Whittaker was one of the few where sort of right off the bat felt like this is the Doctor, right?
Yeah.
And I think that there was an awareness, maybe on the part of the writers, but I think it had more to do with her, capabilities as an actor, that, other sort of other regenerations, you almost have to, have the Doctor go off the rails a little bit initially just to make the transition so that when then the Doctor appears and is a little bit different, you're okay. And here, the gender is different. And so it's like, we've got to emphasize the continuity a little bit more just to make sure people buy this, and are on board with this. And I think, it was realized brilliantly, but then some of the other stories were weak. Also with Capaldi, felt that, they started off trying to make him just sort of irritable and irritating. Mm-hmm. And once they got that out of their system and stopped trying to do that, I thought he was brilliant and has some great speeches and some of what some recapturing of the original Doctor, as well as everything that makes New Who great. I refer to those who don't ever go back and at least learn to appreciate the classic series, Doctor Who Marcionites.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
That's a joke that only people who go to places like Theology Beer Camp will get. But they are the ones who should be, watching this and then going.
So go to Theology Beer Camp. No, I think I mostly agree. I also I didn't like 11 very much, but the thing is, even when you're like not the biggest fan, you still have these speeches that you're like, that was one of the best speeches, right? Like, I watch every year, even though 11's my second to least favorite Doctor, every single year I watch A Christmas Carol because he has this speech where he says, no one important, interesting. I've never met someone who wasn't important before. And every time I get the chills, I'm like, that's so powerful. The guy who's been around 1,000 years, like that's what? It's such a powerful statement. Man, and the whole series is that way. And I'm excited to talk about it. Excited to talk more to you at Theology Beer Camp. If you had to pick one thing, what do you think we should be most excited about when it comes to Theology Beer Camp this year?
I think it's just the fact that all of this, theological, geeking out and fandom geeking out, and doing both simultaneously with other people who also do that, is happening in one place. Right? I mean, there are very few venues where these things come together, right? Now, if you go to a biblical studies or a theology type of gathering, there will be geeks there because we're everywhere. But the geeking out will be sort of tangential to it, happen on the fringes of it. If you go to a nerd out festival of any sort, literal or metaphorical, theology is at the margins of that, although there'll be some people there who are interested in that. This is one of the few places, maybe, the only place that's active that I'm aware of where both of those things are being celebrated together simultaneously, with some real heavy hitters coming to, there's some really great people, great thinkers, who've written about, things to do with, every aspect of that intersection. And it's going to be amazing. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Honestly, a good answer to this question would be to hear Dr. James McGrath. A good answer might be to hear Pete Enns, Trip Fuller, Dan Koch, Dr. Thomas Ord. And for me, if I was going to answer this, it's because it's like a two-part answer. It's a buffet, right? You go and you don't have to be on the geek stage the whole time. You might get burnt out. Maybe you have superhero fatigue, but maybe you're like, I'm going to stay for the Doctor Who part, and then I'm going to go over here and hear Pete Enns talk about some kind of deconstructing faith idea, and he's going to ruin the book of, I don't know, maybe he'll ruin the book of Judges this time. For those who follow Pete Enns, you know what I mean. Like he actually has a series he calls ruining the. Yeah, okay.
Has he ruined Judges once already? It's like
I think so. Yeah. And then, like, it's so much fun. And not only that, but just as any good buffet, you have those like the little nuggets in between them. Maybe aren't your main foods. Maybe it's not your salad or your steak, but you have like some of these sides and stuff in the halls in between. I've made just like going from one stage to the other, different conversations, just meeting people. It's such a welcoming environment. Everybody there's so loving. I'm surrounded by such a diverse group of people, and I know I stuck out as a sore thumb. I didn't know anybody, and I'm the one guy who's like, I'm not completely against inerrancy. That's kind of you're not supposed to. But everybody was so loving, so kind. We all got along. They picked on my beliefs, and it was fine. I picked on them, and we all had so much fun. And yeah, you got to go. It's going to be in Springfield, Missouri this year, October 19th through 21st. Again, that code in the notes. Don't miss it, guys. Just don't miss it. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add or anything you wanted to sign off with before we end this thing?
No, I do hope that, Trip and others involved in organizing will listen to this and will, put Pete Enns and I on different stages at different times. That he's ruining Judges while I'm ruining Star Trek, or something like that. That would just be a great, head-to-head sort of thing. Have people two who want both ruined, but equally and can't decide. But other than that, since we focused on Doctor Who and Star Trek, there's not a lot else to say except thanks for having me on here, and hope to see you at Theology Beer Camp. And may the force be with you.
Yeah. And may the force be with you. And as I like to say when I end most of my calls, Allons-y.